Some of the shores of Britain are surprisingly lonely, considering how overpopulated this island is. Here in the Western Isles, autumn sunshine gives way to autumn gales, unobserved by anyone except a few crofters and fishermen. This, you would think, is the domain of nature, where the hand of man has left few fingerprints. Yet, it is significant that when a mysterious disease swept round these unpopulated coasts, suspicion fell at once on human activities. The victims were seals. The spring and summer of 1988 saw thousands of them die, as biologists and animal welfare organizations struggled to identify the disease, let alone control or treat it. Britain is the home of two species of seals. These are grey seals, confusingly more numerous here than the common seal, but much rarer on a world scale. Britain holds half the world population. The pups are born in the autumn, after their mothers have lolloped ashore on certain favoured pupping beaches. This colony in the Monarch Islands produces about 4,000 pups a year. Their silky white coats and doleful expression make the pups look cuddly beyond belief. Their mothers are attentive, if sometimes a little clumsy in their maternal concern. The colony is crowded, noisy, and sometimes dangerous, though this is hard to believe in the balmy days of September. This particular beach is unusual as a grey seal breeding place. It's sheltered and sandy, in contrast to the exposed rocky coasts where they normally come ashore. The only danger to the pups on a fine autumn morning comes from the curiosity of the bull seals, which land slightly later in the season in search of mates. Its mother's protection is invaluable to a helpless pup. The pups usually stay close to their mothers to avoid being crushed in the turmoil once the males come ashore. The males roll idly away from each protesting female in turn. It's not yet time for the mating season, and they can take things easy. All the seals come ashore for the breeding season, even though many of them won't mate for the first time for another 3 or 4 years. Meanwhile, young males spar in the shallows, practicing for much more serious fighting in later seasons. These annual gatherings of whole seal populations in crowded colonies on shore are natural breeding grounds for parasites and disease. As 1988 showed, it only needed one little virus, or was that all it took? A few miles away, nearer to the Scottish mainland, there's a breeding area for the principal victim of the '88 plague, the common seal. Common seals breed earlier in the year than greys, coming ashore in May and June to have their pups. The newborn pups are much more advanced than grey seal pups. They've already molted their curly white coats before they were born, and they can swim and explore their surroundings from day one. They need an attentive mother even more than the grey seal pups, to shepherd them about in the water and around the rocks. Common seals live all round the coasts of the North Sea and up into Scandinavian waters. The European population numbered about 27,500 in 1988, of which about 5,000 lived round the shores of Britain. They're much more sociable than grey seals, with more frequent and more amiable contacts between individuals. Mother and pup are inseparable, in the water as well as on land. They doze nose to nose between exploratory trips in the welcoming waters of the North Sea. The seaweed beds round the shore provide no more than a playground for the pups at this stage. They won't catch fish for weeks yet, but the exercise will come in useful when they have to find their own food. The pups grow very fast on a diet of mother's milk. From a birth weight of 10 kilograms, they put on 1 kilo a day, doubling their weight in the first fortnight. Even though a pup seems to be exploring alone, its mother is usually close at hand, ready to support it, to teach it the ways of the sea, and to play with it in the water. Grey seals are cooler towards their young. They don't have such a close family life. Common seals are successful breeders thanks to the closeness of the members of the colony. The females will even adopt orphaned pups or those which have strayed too far from their own mothers. Indeed, some would say that they breed too successfully. Fishermen accuse them of depleting the fish stock, and periodically there's a call for the population to be reduced by shooting, or culling as it is euphemistically called. Such a demand was in the pipeline in 1988, as in every other year. But as that damp grey summer began, events overtook the common seals of the North Sea. It started round the coasts of Scandinavia on the shores of the Kattegat. Pups were born prematurely and later their mothers died. Soon the disease spread into the North Sea and even up into Norway. The first impact in Britain was on the coast of East Anglia. Joe Reed is the warden of the nature reserve at Blakeney Point on the Wash.
Towards the end of July, when the pups were arriving on the beaches, and we discovered more than the usual amount of dead pups for the time of the year. In any normal year, there's a certain amount of mortality, but this year there seemed to be more than the average. And then it wasn't until about the 15th of August that we started to find dead adults. And then in 2 days, 15th and 16th of August, we found 10 dead adults. So we then immediately contacted the Sea Mammal Research Unit in Cambridgeshire, and they sent somebody out, and we managed to collect samples of live seals, dead ones for analysis. I suppose it might have been 4 or 5 days later that they were actually able to confirm that it was the same virus that had affected the seals in the rest of the North Sea.
"3,900 common seals came ashore on the east coast of England in the spring of 1988. As the months went by into August, it was clear that a disaster was in the making. Still, there was no agreement on what caused the disease, but it was all too clear what it did to the seals.
Well, the first indication that something is wrong with them is that they start coughing a lot. They're also very lethargic, and there's sometimes a mucus coming from the nose. In general, the seals are much more approachable than they would normally be. About an hour ago, this one was showing all the signs of the virus, was up on the beach, but still quite lively. And just 1 hour later, here it is dead, and that's the general case with most of them.
For Jim Temple, it was a particularly bitter summer. As the death toll mounted, he found himself doing an unaccustomed job. As Joe Reed collected the corpses, Jim prepared their grave.
For a living, I run ferry trips out to Blakeney Point and to see the seals on the sands out here. But at the minute, I've got the job of burying them on Blakeney Point, where they've been collected from the tide line, and it's all a bit sad. It's obviously very serious. Whether we'll have any left at the end of the day, I don't know, but in the last fortnight we've probably, well, in my opinion, lost well over half, getting on for 3/4 maybe.
With the common seal population falling so fast, pups as well as adults, biologists turned a worried eye on the grey seals, so far unaffected by the mysterious disease. On the rocky shores where they usually breed, there's quite enough pressure on their population already. Many of them bear the scars of encounters with driftwood in storms, and even attacks by predators. This grey seal in Scotland has lost a flipper, and the most probable cause is an attack by a killer whale. Pups can be wounded by flying debris or by being smashed onto the rocks by storm waves. Every year their bodies litter the beaches and drift in the sea, but their breeding rate has evolved to meet these casualties, as well as those caused by the mindless hooliganism of the breeding males when they come ashore to joust for a partner. Because they're so relatively helpless compared with young common seals, the grey pups cannot escape from the violence. Fights at the water's edge are less dangerous to the pups, as the adult males slug it out to find out which is this year's master bull, or to try to force their attentions on unwilling females. On the beach, the disturbance spreads through the colony like, well, like a virus. A virus had been implicated in the disease. As the sand drifted over the corpses in Scotland, a Dutch scientist, Dr. Lies Vedder, had identified a virus similar to that which causes distemper in dogs, which may have caused an outbreak of seal disease in Lake Baikal in Russia.
It is known that there has been a disease in the Baikal Lake, among the Baikal seals, that has been identified as well as canine distemper. It could be that in some or another way through wild animals on land, this disease has passed from the Baikal seal and ended up in the Swedish or the Danish waters. But still, of course, most obvious is a nearby cause, is just on land in Denmark or in Sweden. And we know that there has been canine distemper amongst dogs, more than normal, in the winter and the springtime in this country. So the origin in the Baikal Lake, well, it doesn't look reality, but well, we are invited by the Russians to come and have a look, and also to do the same tests and see if we are dealing with the same disease, and maybe even with the same strain of virus. So that could be an indication, of course, we are dealing with the same origin.
At her famous seal orphanage at Pieterburen in Holland, Lenny Tart was inundated with calls to treat sick animals, and already the facilities were stretched to the limit.
We gaan nu direct weg. Omgeving Noordpolderzeil. I'm here in Pieterburen already for 17 years. I was starting with only baby seals in the summer. It's very uncomplicated. Nothing is wrong with them, only baby seals. But in the time, it's changed my job. It's changed in seals who have had a lot of diseases. And one of the diseases now is the virus, but before we have had a parasite and all kind of things with bacterial problems, when we saw a lot of resistance against all kind of antibiotics. But all those problems we can handle. But now the one with the virus, it's awful.
As Lenny's staff treated the seals, Dr. Vedder continued to search for the real cause of the disease.
First, we had some guesses that herpes virus or epicornavirus might be involved in the disease, and some symptoms were indeed indicating it might be the case. We did some serological tests. We did a kind of test vaccination, and it appeared these two viruses were not the primary cause for this disease. It became more and more apparent during July and beginning of August that we were dealing with something that was giving immune suppression. And well, all these facts together, the clinical symptoms, the immune suppression, and first of all, still the belief that the virus disease was the main cause for this disease, because there's nothing else that can give such a high mortality within a short time amongst one species.
Take a swab. The thing you can see here is that the windpipe is full of froth. Now,
when the dead seals from British beaches were post-mortem, their symptoms were familiar. A discharge from the nose, the windpipe blocked by mucus, both typical in dogs which have died from distemper.
That's probably what has killed this animal finally, that it just has not been able to breathe. Compartments of the lung, it's not in the right place.
Inside the chest, there's an even more grisly sign of the disease. The lungs show that what actually killed this seal was a very severe pneumonia, a secondary effect of the distemper. They're heavily congested with blood until they look more like liver than lungs. This leads to another complication.
The lungs, and we can see a lot of it here. And we call this interstitial emphysema, which really means air between the normal sacs or alveoli of the lung.
Where the lungs have been destroyed by the disease, air leaks out into the rest of the body cavity. This is what causes the changes in behavior seen in so many of the sick seals. They can't dive properly because their chests are full of air. In other circumstances, it would be called a life jacket. But for the seals, it's a death sentence. The research in Holland had narrowed down the search to a small group of viruses similar to canine distemper. When the grey seals began to breed, their pup production was 7/8 of what it should have been. Loss of pups had been a symptom in common seals too. One implication of the work was particularly worrying. The waters of the North Sea are among the most polluted in Europe. Some of the pollutants are known to suppress immunity in certain animals, making them more vulnerable to disease. And the seals which were passing in an increasing stream through the post-mortem room showed signs of suppressed immunity, as Dr. Vedder had observed. It began to look as though the spread of the disease had been accelerated by the condition of the water in which the seals have to find their food. The northern North Sea is cleaner than the southern parts, but the elements in the food chain had all been found to be contaminated to some extent, from the birds which nest in huge numbers among the cliffs of Orkney and Shetland, down to their staple food, the sand eel. It was in Shetland as early as 1983 that the seabird breeding season failed, when the sand eels disappeared. Huge shoals such as this became a rare sight. The disaster was put down to overfishing by humans, but our collective guilt over the pollution of the North Sea led some scientists to question whether overfishing was the whole answer. Many pollutants accumulate in the bodies of predators which feed on contaminated prey. Thus, the dose increases from one level of the food chain to the next, until the top predators are taking a concentrated dose with every mouthful. From crabs and shrimps to predatory fish and so on up the chain, the potential danger increases. And seals are effectively the top of the food chain in British waters. If the seabirds had been affected by pollution as well as overfishing, could the same be true of the seals? By now, the seal plague was in every daily newspaper. It had become a media event as well as a biological catastrophe. Attention was focused not only on the plight of the seals, but also on the state of the North Sea. Every British viewer and reader knew that we have our share of responsibility for whatever was going wrong. The RSPCA set up a seal unit in Norfolk to treat the sick animals. Other organisations joined in the effort, realising that their involvement would give them evidence which they could use in their other campaigns and a platform from which to spread their message.
Greenpeace is involved in the seal unit for humanitarian reasons. We believe that we should try to do at least something for some of the seals. Whether in fact we're going to be successful or not, one doesn't know. We're also involved in it because we're concerned about the state of the North Sea and the pollutants that are going into it. The other thing that Greenpeace is concerned about is that the EEC has a blacklist of some 130 different substances, which we would also like to see immediately banned from discharge into the North Sea.
There is no concrete evidence of a link between the disease itself and pollution. I don't think any scientist would now claim that pollution had caused the death of these seals. Some people feel that the severity and extent of this disease may be related to the fact that some of the seals come from areas where there are very high levels of certain organic contaminants which are known to reduce the resistance to disease of animals in the laboratory. So the link, if there is one, is that these animals their resistance to the disease was reduced by the pollution in their tissues. And what we're trying to do with our Dutch colleagues now is actually carry out the experiments and the sampling that will allow us to test that hypothesis. And the idea there is that if we can identify the specific compounds that might have caused this problem, then it's possible to implement very tight controls about any leakage of those compounds into the environment. And it will actually make the monitoring job much simpler.
There is no clear, unequivocal evidence that pollutants are responsible for this particular problem, but there probably never will be. And we feel that the fact that there are pollutants going into the North Sea and that the seal, which is at the top of the food chain and therefore has a large amount of these chemicals in their bodies, that is inevitably going to have an effect.
Of course, this is a big disaster because a lot of seals will disappear, at least in our Wadden Sea area. It could end up in 80 or 90% mortality, which means a lot of seals will die or still will die, and not much will be left. But the seals in our sea are also suffering from effects of pollution.
Was pollution to blame? The scientists say not. Samples from dead seals showed that their blubber contained relatively small amounts of the chemicals which cause suppression of immunity. Although most grey seals seem to have caught the disease, very few of them died. The survivors are now immune, thanks to antibodies formed as they recovered. "17,000 common seals died in Europe in 1988, 3,000 of them in Britain. In Holland, the mortality was 60%. In the spring of 1989, only 2,000 common seals came ashore to breed on the east coast of England, where there were twice that number the previous year. A few were sick and 3 were found dead. The virus was still around. The seal plague of 1988 may have been a rare natural disaster. Pollution may not have been directly involved. But the deaths of all those seals focused attention on our guilty knowledge that the North Sea is a mess, and that it is the joint responsibility of European countries to clean it up. Next time, pollution might be the cause, and we know all too well that humans can suffer from the suppression of their immunity just as much as seals. Next time, the victims might be us.